Hey everybody, welcome to the GMG review. Today we are taking a look at Warhammer the Horus Heresy Legions Imperialis, the rulebook. So this is for the core rules of the game. There will be two separate other videos covering the two armies that come in this game. But today we're going to focus on the actual core principles of playing the game and the rulebook to go with my how to play video. So this is going to familiarize yourself before you jump in. So what do we have here in this rulebook? Now this comes in the two-player starter set, and it contains a 236-page set of rules, including background and history of the Horus Heresy, army lists for the Legions Astartes of Solar Auxilia, the strategic assets of the Knights and the Titans, a hobby section, and reference sheets, along with, in that reference sheets, a set of the tokens that you're free to photocopy and make copies of to play the game. I'm going to do a separate how-to video next week on how to make these look a lot nicer and last a lot longer and zhuzh them up a little bit by scanning and photocopying what comes in here for your gameplay. Infinity players are already going to kind of know where I'm going with this. Let's dive in and talk about the core principles of this game. Now, on Thursday next week, you're going to get to see a side-by-side comparison of this with the original Space Marine, which is the infantry expansion for Titanicus from the 80s. This game it has a healthy dose of original Titanicus and the infantry stuff like Space Marine in its DNA. Things like the close assault factor, the order system, the alternate activations, all that's kind of baked in. And what I'm going to give you today is a general overview of those rules so that you can have a sort of like a basic grasp of the core principles. So the first thing you're going to do, obviously, is muster an army, and we're actually going to go into playing the game last because we're going to do this in the order that you would actually do it in. So mustering an army, simple stuff first. You have to pick your allegiance and your army list. Now your army list is going to be, in this case, either the Legio of the Space Marines, like the Astartes, Legio Astartes, or you're going to have the Solar Auxilia as your two sort of like key factions. Then you're going to choose your allegiance. Are you a traitor or are you loyal? You're going to assemble your compulsory formations and complete your army. So now when you assemble a compulsory formation, you have to pick a formation to be. Those formations each have a card, so here we have the Legio Demi Company as an example, or a Legion Garrison Force. You have compulsory detachments inside that, optional, and then one of the following at the bottom. So basically you have to take this, you can fill each of these little buttons as much as you want, and then you can have either one of these or one of these. So these are like the limited things, these are the optional things, these are the required things. You also sometimes get special rules. So for instance, the Legion Demi Company has Heart of the Legion. You get to up your tactical strength for holding objectives for vehicles in a formation that's with those infantry. Basically showing the fact that you can garrison things. Other things like a Legion Garrison Force, no special rules. So in this box set, for instance, the Legion Demi Company is going to be what you're going to basically be able to build out of the two-player starter set, and vice versa. That goes for the Tertio. We're going through the rest of these special rules here. The Solar Auxilia sub-cohort. And they look pretty similar. You have to have some core units, you have to have an HQ, and you have to have a support. They're all available out of that box set, so you'll be ready to play them. Now, when you make that, your parent army list has to be at least 70% of your required points to play. So in a 1,000-point game, let's say, which is almost what you can make for each side of this box set, you could have 300 points of other things like Titans, or Auxilia units if you're playing the Marines, or Marine units if you're playing the Auxilia, and 700 points would have to be spent on the core formations that you have in here. So your Demi Company would be roughly 700 points. You can have more than one of these companies and core formations, but the idea is that you should be able to fill this up before you move on to another one. As long as you do the compulsories, though, you can have as many of these formations as you want. So you can have a Demi Company and a Legion Garrison Force, as long as you can get the compulsory detachments for both. You can have both in your army, and they would both count towards being your parent army as long as they're both from, let's say, the same Legion. So if you have a bunch of Space Wolves, you could have a Legion Demi Company of them, you could have a Legion Garrison Force of them, and then you could have another 300 points in a 1,000-point game of, let's say, some Raven Guard, or some Knights, or Titan, or some Auxilia, and you can mix and match. And that's it. So that's how you muster your army. It's pretty simple. The unit cards that are available make it a lot easier to kind of visualize during the game who's where and who's in what company. But overall, the unit construction is pretty simple. There are upgrades and stuff, but for the most part, point costs are pretty flat. Then you're going to play a game, and that means that you're going to start by generating a mission. And the mission sets in here are actually pretty flexible. There's quite a bit to do and play. And we're gonna muster army. Here we go. They're pretty like reminiscent of the missions from Titanicus. So when you fight a battle, you're going to generate a mission with a 2d6 roll. It's a d6 and a d6, and there's 12 separate missions that you can play in this box set, going from confrontation to like a season hold, no man's land, hold ground, stronghold assault, devastation, a flanking action, a retrieval, push forward, conquest, all-out war, and a point assault. They all give you a different type of deployment and a different way to win. On top of that, and much like Titanicus for Titanicus players, you'll have secondaries that are secret. You roll 2d6, you have to reroll any doubles. So you have bonus ones like Carnage, Vital Intelligence, Control the Battlefield, Breakthrough, Plant Standard, and Be Defiant. Those will give you additional ways of scoring victory points into the end of the game, and you get to pick one for the course of the game, secret from your opponent, and declare if you've gotten it when you're all done. So that's it. There we are. We're set up. We mustered our army. We've determined a mission that we're going to play. We've gone through the deployment steps from this. Let's say we're playing all-out war, right? So you're going to deploy, put objective markers down, and then scoring is pretty reminiscent of games like 40K. So for instance, in all-out war, at the end of each round, you score 3 VPs for each uncontested objective marker in your deployment zone that you control, and 7 VPs for each uncontested objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone that they control. Deployment zones are halves, so it's some pretty high scoring. And then you get your secondaries on top of it. All right, let's get into the actual round sequence. Now, unless specified otherwise, every game is 5 rounds. And the general sort of like overview of the game is going to always be the same. It'll start with the orders phase, then you have the initiative phase, the movement phase, the combat phase, and the end phase. You start off by assigning orders. You're going to put all your orders face down next to each of your detachments, and model by model, you don't assign orders, you assign them to the groups of models called detachments. Now those orders could be any of the 4 that are generally on the table, unless you're broken. Broken units can only charge or advance, they can no longer march, and they can no longer first fire. And that's kind of to like show off like the attrition effect of being damaged, losing your weapons, losing your specialists and your guys and stuff. Then we have the initiative phase. It's a simple roll-off between the 2 commanders. Whoever wins has the initiative for the round, and will pick a unit to activate first during each of the sequences later on. The movement phase, you get to pick a unit to move with. It'll move following its order. So for instance, if it is marching, it'll move triple if it's infantry, double if it's not. If it is advancing, it'll make a move, just a normal move based on its profile. And if it's got first fire orders or charge orders, it'll charge if it's eligible, if there's someone within a double moves range. And if it's first fire, it can't move at all because it's too busy kind of sitting on Overwatch. There is an interrupt mechanic that models with first fire can basically shoot things that move by them, which allows you to, I guess, circumvent the idea that people sitting still could be outmaneuvered by models going from cover to cover and not be able to shot at. But they do have a snapfire rule where they're -2 to hit. Again, this is I would say, a legacy rule from old versions of this game. And then you have the combat phase. In the combat phase, you're going to have the ability to fire. It starts with your first fire stage. Anyone with the first fire order shoots. Then the engagement stage. Anybody in combat does their melees, basically. And then they go to the advancing fire stage. Anyone with an advance order then fires. And this is actually a really small sequence of events and a small change from the way that this game used to be played, in that once you've done your engagement, you're pushed out of combat typically, unless you've drawn and you're still locked in, which means that you're going to be eligible to be fired at or to be a target, basically. And you can't just hide kind of in the open by being in melee, because the combat sequence will make sure that the advancing models get something to shoot at, which is very cool. If you're engaged, there are special rules for engagement. If something is the same size as you or less, it's basically blocked from being shot at. But if you are bigger than the thing that you are engaging, you're still eligible to be at a target, otherwise without a penalty. So it means that things like Titans can't be engaged with infantry and not get shot at. You can still shoot them, which is a handy sort of like differential. All right, basic attack sequences are pretty simple. You're going to have a profile card, and that profile card is going to have some core stats. So you're gonna have your point value, your detachment size, how many models are inside that detachment, your type and what your scale is. Your scale is how big you are, which also typically translates into how well you control objectives. You've got your name, so like these guys are Assault Marines, they move 7, they save on a 5+, they have a +3 to their close assault value, a 3+ morale, 1 wound, they're armed with bull pistols, which have a 6-inch range, 1 dice, 5+, no AP, and have the light trait, which means they can't hurt things with an armored value. or that are armored vehicles. And then you have whatever your upgrade is. So if these guys have 4 stands base, they can add either 2 for 12 points or 4 more for 24 points. And they have the special universal keyword, Jump Pack. Every unit uses the same detachment card, no matter who they are. They could be Titans, they could be other Astartes, they could be whoever. They're all going to work off this same basic card, and they're going to mix and match different keywords and different abilities to differentiate from themselves. So even the mightiest like Warlord Titan uses that card. He's just gonna have some special rules that are gonna make him feel a little bit more different when he plays. All right, so let's talk about the shooting stuff. If you were going to roll to make an attack, there's rules for fast dice, but basically you're gonna total up how many dice in the stand have the same profile. So if we had an assault detachment, all 4 bolt pistols, you'd roll 4 dice on 5s for each one that's in range. And then apply it with whatever its AP is to the saving throw of the target unit. So if Assault Marines were shooting Assault Marines in this case, it'd be 4 dice hitting on 5s. Each hit would result in a saving throw of 5+. Each failed saving throw is a wound, which removes a stand. It's a pretty simple multi-model resolution system for combat that ends up with models getting removed relatively quickly. You might be surprised a bit by the saving throws on here, that they look fairly low, but they're not. They have, because of like the frequency of hits, when the infantry's fighting the infantry, it feels fairly, I think, like appropriate to whatever it is. But you may be surprised by what does and doesn't have saves in this game, and how the Marines may not feel quite as tough as you're expecting, considering the fact that you know they're Astartes. All right, let's talk about my favorite phase, which is the engagement subphase and the fights. Now, close assaults are very different than shooting. They're done with a 2d6 roll, and they're divided up very much like Lord of the Rings combat. So if you played the Middle Earth strategy battle game, it's very similar to that in that you will pair up every combat once the engagement and the charge is done into either one-on-ones or many-on-one fights. And every time you have to fight a further combat after the first, if you're in a many-on-one combat, your opponent gets an additional attack die. Attacks are resolved by rolling 2d6, adding your close assault factor, and whoever gets the highest roll, the loser takes a wound. Now, that's why you end up with things like close assault factors of 14 for a Warlord Titan. So they're gonna roll 2d6 and add 14 to the dice roll if they fight a stand of Space Marines. Now, stand of Space Marines is only +2 typically, which means they're just gonna get obliterated the first time round. But if you send a bunch of different Space Marines, the last Space Marine stand fighting that Warlord Titan is still rolling 2d6 and adding 14, but that stand of Space Marines is rolling 6d6 and adding 2. So the chances are that you can overwhelm anyone by making them fight often enough, and the bigger a base you are on, the more vulnerable you are to getting overwhelmed by small numbers. Once the fight's over, whoever's won the most individual combats in the site is said to have basically won the fight. The opponent has to make a morale check or withdraw. If they tie, they stay in combat. Once you're forced to withdraw, you're also potentially broken, which means you're below half your starting model count. That's going to limit the number of orders you can take, and also mean that you have to make a check when you fall back if you're fleeing, if you're in the fallback orders, instead of getting a regular order. Basically means you're like on a fixed order until you rally. And so then we're into probably what I would say makes this the most unique as far as the gameplay, because so far everything we've talked about, it's pretty standard stuff. Alternating activations, blind order pools. We've seen this in this same game before. What I think makes this game in this edition a bit more unique is they've modernized the terrain rules significantly. 40K, for instance, doesn't use very interesting terrain rules. You just kind of have walls, different flavors of walls, sometimes dangerous walls, and things that slow you down. Terrain in this game can be garrisoned. It's well defined as obstructing terrain, obstacles, difficult obstacles, or structures. And intact structures are very important. In fact, when you see my GMG review of the box set itself, you'll hear me talk about how important I think it is that you have buildings to play this game, because they are kind of the most interesting thing that makes this game different from a game of Warhammer. You can hide inside buildings, you can occupy buildings, and every type of building based on the box it comes on, so either Civitas Imperialis, Militaris Imperialis, Imperialis Grandis, or Fortifications, have their own armor save, their own garrison number, so the number of detachments that can hide inside them, their own wound count, and then bonuses to either defend them or be hit from shooting against them, and they have a cover save they provide to the infantry inside. So you can always hide infantry in them. As long as half the infantry and detachment can get into base contact with one, they can get inside of it, and they can hide and hold buildings. It's a really cool mechanic. It's very reminiscent of the way the game was played originally for Space Marine, and it is, I think, probably the most interesting part of this game, hopping from building to building. There's also special rules for the way that you drive infantry out of them. So when you do engagement orders and you fight in the combat phase against them, you push people out. They can be attacked individually too by weapons that have the Demolisher special rule, which means your Titans, who can just literally like body them by body checking themselves into them or firing their Demolisher weapons, and certain vehicles and tanks are actually specialized in digging things out of buildings. It makes those units unique. It makes the table actually matter. And I think one of the coolest things about this building is you can have the table change states over the course of the game. What's a full structure at the start of the game can be a collapsed structure by the end of the game. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that makes this game more interesting than just sort of standard walls. It makes it not feel like paintball. The terrain matters. And for a game at this scale, I think that's a really important distinction. There's special rules for Titans. Now, this is another important thing. I think for people playing Titanicus, one of the things they worried about with this game is it's going to make the Titans feel a little less than they are. They do not feel less than they are, and I think the core essence of what makes them interesting in a game like this has been maintained in this game. They do still feel lumbering. They are limited in the number of turns they can make, and they are very powerful on the tabletop. There's some really basic rules for your shields, for walking over obstacles, and the fact that the scale and the movement phase matters. So if you have a larger scale than something, you just walk over it as long as you can clear its bases. It means that these guys stride across the battlefield, you can't pen them in, and they really do lord over all the infantry and tanks that are on the table in a way that feels appropriate. Also, their guns are terrifying. And the fact that they can simply body check and body buildings and are just inherently demolishers by stepping on stuff is a very cool factor. As far as the rest of the book goes, we're kind of through the core mechanics now. We're just going to talk about the weapon traits and the special rules. This is what tends to be the thing that makes vehicles and infantry and tanks feel unique. So things like barrage weapons that can destroy buildings, Demolisher, which I mentioned earlier, have the ability to make a unit of tanks not just feel like a pool of dice. They allow them to operate differently from other vehicles on the table. And then other things like, for instance, burrowing, where you can get through into the rear arc of things, or bypass that allows you to ignore void shields when you're shooting weapons, can again make things seem slightly different. You got everything from Firestorm to Graviton Pulse, which means you use like the Flamer template, Engine Killer, which allows you to fight Titanic units at a bonus, and things like Impale too, that allow you to blow up things with a larger detachment scale. So like the larger a vehicle is, or a unit, the more dangerous it is. On top of that, of course, you got tons of traits and special rules, things like Armored, which means that if you have the light rule, you can reroll saves against it. So that's why bolt pistols don't work great against vehicles. Automated Sentry, which can be on your Tarantulas and your Laser Rapier Destroyers. And of course, things like Commander, which is your army commander and the way that they can attach to units. And then, of course, we have the vehicle section and the special rules for vehicles, like assault transports for when you can get out of your vehicles and still fight, and flyers, and how they are uniquely operating on the battlefield. And so that's it for the core rules. We're really looking at what makes this unique. And what do I think about that? Well, I'm excited that this uses so much of the original DNA from Space Marine and Titanicus, but with a modern sort of approach. The information is presented better and presented all in one place. So for instance, on the detachment cards previously, in the older versions of this game, what you wouldn't get is you wouldn't get things like the weapon stats. You would get the close assault factor, you would get the movement of a unit, for instance, and maybe the name of its special rules. But what you wouldn't have is you wouldn't have this. You wouldn't have that sort of modern presentation in a 40K way of what your guns do and how they work. That's just one example kind of that modern presentation. But it means that at a glance, you're playing the game and not digging through the rulebook constantly for information. There's more stuff like that in here. But the general sort of like vibe of this book, which makes it different from previous versions, is that everything you need is sort of condensed into what do you need when you need it and presented in that way. There's also a much larger mission structure, so like more ways to play the game, and the general rules for buildings are expanded upon and a lot cleaner. Also, small quality of life improvements like the order of operations for the combats, and generally making the units feel like they're behaving in a way that is both appropriate to the situation, so like falling back out of a building when they lose the fight, but also that they fall into if they win a fight and can occupy a building for free. It just means that everything's kind of more cinematic, I guess. They're not just wound blobs wandering around the table. And my experience so far has been that even though the scale of the game is very small, you can kind of see what's happening and feel the story unfolding mechanically through what's happening during the game. So far so good. You can check out the next 2 videos today on the 2 army lists, where I'll go through sort of the key dynamics, how they work, what you can expect from them, and of course, sort of the best way to start those 2 armies out of the 2-player starter set with what's available in the box, and kind of to get you going and playing the game. So big thanks for watching. I'll see you for more parts of this GMG review and more stuff on Legions Imperialis this week. Till then, I'm Ash, up gaming.
Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed that video, and thank you for watching. If you want to find out more about me and see what I'm up to, you can check me out on Facebook at facebook.com/outofthebasementintothestreets or Instagram at Guerrilla Miniature Games. You can also find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Guerrilla Miniature Games, and of course, you can now follow on Patreon if you don't want to back and see what's new. Thanks for watching.